It's going to be preserved for posterity.
My. 1333. All right. There it is. Apparently it does go to 4 digits with no problem at all when you're making slides. It takes my little computer a very long time to load the slideshow now. All right. We are going to talk about Islam, the ultimate proof, which we've been using on as the A.I.C.P. What are we going to talk about? We're going to justify it. And that's really important. Because we've been using it and you're like, this is amazing. Yes, it is. Why is it amazing? We haven't answered that question yet very directly. We're going to do that today. And then we're going to talk about the problem of evil. In some sense, it's a very significant problem. In other senses, it's not a problem if you have good theology. But the fact that evil exists is something that has affected us all. And it has affected everybody that we're going to talk to. And it's an important point and an objection that comes up very frequently. So, first, Islam. Islam is the Unitarian counterfeit. We had last week the polytheistic biblical counterfeit. That was, what was that? Mormonism. Mormonism is considered by some to be the most polytheistic religion in the entire world because they do believe in an infinite number of gods. Well, your God is of this world. Well, how did he come out? Well, he was from another God. Well, how about him? Just keep going back. Like, it never ends as far as they're concerned.
Does that include Catholicism?
No. It doesn't include Hinduism. Hinduism has, what, 330 some odd million gods or something like that?
Yeah.
Mormonism has them beat. It's pretty crazy. So, Unitarian. What I mean by Unitarian? Well, I mean we believe in one God in one person. We are a Trinitarian. We have one God in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Islam being Unitarian, they have Allah, believing to be unipersonal, hence Unitarian. Now, Muslims. They believe in the Quran. They have their holy book, along with the Hadith, which are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They have the single God, Allah, who, as I said, is Unitarian. Many will say because of the similarities in some regard, they have their holy book, they have their prophets, they have a single God, that Islam provides the best objection to Christianity. And it also provides the most frequent objection to the method of apologetics that I've been teaching you in all of our classes so far. The question is simply this. Can the Muslim, with his God and his book, do what you do with the Bible? Well, no, he can't. And then we're going to explain how he cannot. Not may not or does not, but cannot. But before we do so, let's do a little bit of background on Islam. A little bit of background is always useful. So, Islam means submission. What does that mean? Peace? Through subjugation. Islam means submission. Submission to the will of God, the will of Allah. As I mentioned earlier, they're Unitarian in their view of God as opposed to Trinitarian. They consider the Trinity idolatrous. Shirk, if you is the term they use for that, having other gods and alongside Allah. They understand one person in God. They accept Muhammad. How you spell Muhammad, either with a U or with an O, depends. It comes out of Arabic, and the translation and the letters don't correspond exactly. He is the last and greatest prophet of Allah. Muhammad was born about 570 AD. Islam kicks off around 600 AD. Muhammad dies in 630. Now, Muhammad lived in Arabia. Arabia was a place of many gods. One of the gods in Arabia at the time was Allah. Muhammad insisted that Allah was the only true God, and he got more than a little pushback on this issue. So he flees to a town called Mecca, gathered a following, and subsequently became warlike as he promoted his religion. Islam has historically been a religion that has been advanced by the sword, and the religious texts, the Quran and the Hadith, bear this out. It's why we've had groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and why Europe is beginning to fall to Islam. They don't come in peaceably and hand out tracts and preach on street corners. They come insisting that you bow to their religion once they get enough people in it. Establish Sharia law and rejection of it doesn't go well for you. Now, this does not mean that all Muslims advocate for that kind of violent activity. They don't. Many of them don't. But it doesn't mean, of course, that violent strains of Islam don't exist. They certainly do. And they tend to exist in majority Muslim countries. Furthermore, such violent expansion is sanctioned by the Quran and the Hadith in places. It's something they cannot completely escape, though Western Muslims tend to be somewhat embarrassed by it. Those who are Muslims in the Middle East and majority Muslim countries don't want to escape it. They often are very fine with it. Even so, nearly all Muslims in the United States are of the non-violent variety. If you're not a majority, right, for now, And I suspect it's going to stay that way, at least here in the U.S. Other parts of the world like Europe, I don't know. We'll see how it turns out here in a few years. But we are not a majority Muslim country. They are nonviolent. So it makes evangelizing them, shall we say, easier. They're not going to be holding a sword to your throat or a gun to your head. It makes it easier to talk to them about Jesus. So, Muslim doctrines. What do they believe? This is something we need to know. There are 5 primary doctrines in Islam, a few smaller ones at the end, and there are also 5 pillars of Islam, which are slightly different. So, primary doctrines of Islam. First of all, Allah is the one true God. There is no God but Allah. Muhammad is his prophet. In fact, that is called the Shahada.
Congratulations, you're a Muslim.
Only if you say it in Arabic and actually mean it. So yes, that's important. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. Allah is the one true God. Now, Allah has also sent many prophets to guide men. Muhammad is the latest and greatest of these prophets. They do consider Jesus to have been a prophet, and actually don't describe any sin to him, which is interesting. Of the 4 inspired books, the Quran is the most important. 4. I hope this immediately sparked a question around what are the other 3? This is very, very, very helpful to us. The other 3 are the Law of Moses, the Psalms of David, and the Gospel of Jesus. They affirm, according to their own documents, the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and the Gospels. Very, very helpful. The Quran recognizes them as previous revelation. They will tell you that Jews and Christians are still, quote, people of the book. That's their terminology. They will claim, though, that the Bible has been corrupted, of course. More on that later. So, next, of those 4 inspired books, what else do they believe? They believe there are many angels and demons in the world. This is no small emphasis in the religion of Islam. There's a lot of angelology and demonology in their religion. They believe also, I keep pointing at the wall instead of the computer. There's a final day of judgment coming, where all men will be resurrected to heaven or hell based on one's works. Final day of judgment. Now, heaven in Islam is described as a place of sensuous delight, particularly for men, where women will be serving men for all eternity in a variety of ways. Yes, that way. You've heard of the 70 virgin promise? Yes, that's part of it. It's what Allah said after all. We're going to have to accept it. That is what they teach. There's also a doctrine of Kismet. It's not a primary doctrine. Kismet is kind of like fatalism. Kismet itself means fate. It goes beyond biblical determinism. Saying God, we talk about it frequently, the fact that God has an eternal decree, the one true God, and that he is working all things together for that purpose throughout all history. All right. But this is not a fatalism. In other words, it doesn't matter what we do. Things are going to work out the way Allah has determined. That's that. Christians would say, no, it very much matters what we do. We make choices that are meaningful and for which we're held responsible, even though God has determined all things. So there's the difference. Islam, therefore, believes in no sense of freedom at all, officially. Do they act that way? No. But that's another issue. The 5 pillars of Islam are slightly different. We talked about the 5 doctrines with the minor doctrine, Kismet. Islam has 5 pillars in addition to the doctrines that I just mentioned. First, related to something before that Kip and I have already kind of half joked about, is their creed, the Shahada. It has to be recited in Arabic and believed in order to become a Muslim. Namely, it says this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's what it is. And no, I did not just become a Muslim because I don't believe that. But that is their Shahada. You have to do that. Secondly, you must pray 5 times a day toward Mecca. That's their big city. Israel has Jerusalem. Islam has Mecca. Medina is a smaller town. We'll talk about that maybe. And we mentioned it. We'll just deal with this for now. Mecca. You have to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca. Third, you must practice almsgiving, which is, in their understanding, the highest form of good works, according to Islam. Giving to the poor. Fourth, you must click the button. You must fast during the month of Ramadan. You've heard the term Ramadan that's been used more and more frequently in the news as Islam becomes more popular and more accepted in the United States. Ramadan, you have to fast, but only when the sun is up. So as long as the sun is shining, you're not supposed to eat. Once it goes down, gorge yourself if you want. But that's how the month of Ramadan works. Now, they operate on a lunar calendar with regard to Ramadan, not a solar calendar. So Ramadan moves throughout the year because you've got 28 days rather than 30 or 31.
I think it's happening right now.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And I've known it to happen in July before. So it's just kind of, that's how it goes. So you fast during the month of Ramadan, gorge yourself at night. During the day, no. Water is fine. They will let you drink, which when Ramadan is in July is probably a pretty good idea. Fifth, if you are able, you are supposed to make a pilgrimage to Mecca at one point in your life. If you're physically able, find some way to get to Mecca. Yep, the Hajj is the correct term for that. H-A-J, I believe, if you want to spell it. 2 J's. I think it's 2 J's. It's spelled almost as crazy as French. I never figured out French spelling. Anyway, they have good bread though. The Hajj, pilgrimage to Mecca once in your life if you are able. And technically, well, there sort of is a sixth. What do you think the sixth one is? You've heard the term a lot. Ta-da! I have it with an asterisk because it's kind of, but not really, the sixth pillar of Islam. Jihad is the practice of holy war. You purge the world of infidels, be it a nation, a group of people, or even an individual. This has to be declared by the ruling power of Islam at the time, a guy known as the Caliph. Caliph is C-A-L-I-P-H, if you wanted to know how to spell that. There hasn't been a declared Caliph that has been universally recognized by Islam in a very long time. There have been a lot of little ones that claim a new caliphate. The Caliph is the guy who occupies the caliphate. You know, like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, things like that. Because they believe that they've installed a new Caliph, that's why they get so violent and go to war to purge the world of the infidels. It follows from Islam teaching. So, Muslims will fight amongst themselves, though, generally speaking, whenever they start to get power. You've heard of Sunni and Shiite Muslims? They're not like Baptists and Presbyterians. Baptists and Presbyterians, we have our disagreements and we talk about them on social media. Such Sunnis and Shiites, if left to themselves, can get violent. Islam has never, whenever they start to get power, they destroy themselves. They self-destruct. So it eventually does tend to happen. That has been the history of things. So let's see. Having had a little bit of background on them, then let's do this. When we're talking to Muslims and we speak of Islam, you must keep this in mind. You must not get led astray into thinking that what I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion about Islam, namely we have the Bible, they have the Quran, then all you get is a Mexican standoff, so to speak. It's just our book versus theirs. That's not how it works. What we do is the same thing we do with anything else, any other worldview. Remember, at the very bottom, Islam is their own worldview. It's a religio-political worldview, but it's a worldview. So we compare the actual content. What do we do? Internal critique, just like we do with anything else. And it tends to fall apart really, really fast. It's embarrassing, honestly. Remember what I said earlier, that there are 4 books of Revelation that they call them, and 3 of them we have. So where do you think you're going to go? Let's talk about that. What does it look like? They hand us the law, the Psalms, and the Gospels on a silver platter. All right, let's look at the law, the Psalms, and the Gospels and see how they compare to what you officially teach in your book. Your internal critique will compare various Quranic teachings with the Bible, which creates problems very, very quickly. For example, Islam denies the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Surah, which think of that as chapter. Surah 4, ayah, or verse 157, explicitly denies the crucifixion of Jesus. They also, I think it's almost funny in some of these. In Surah 19, you have a teaching that states that Jesus, or the mother of Jesus, Mary, was the sister of Moses and Aaron, Miriam. Seriously. That is a serious historical confusion. It is in Surah 19. Why did they think that was the case? Well, Muhammad was hearing these things spoken of, possibly by Christians, and the names sound similar to one another. So, it ended up getting into the book. A big mistake, just a few hundred years separated, that's all.
How can they deny the crucifixion if they go with the Gospels?
That's the point. The Gospels are the revelation that come first. They say, well, the Gospel of Jesus was given to you, people of the book. All right, well, it says that Jesus was crucified. Well, that could never happen. Allah would never allow that to happen to one of his prophets. It must have only seemed that way, which is what Surah 4, 157 says. Now, seemed that way is interpreted differently depending on what Muslim you talk to. Most of them believe Judas was substituted for Jesus. Sorry, and never mind that Judas went and hanged himself after the crucifixion.
Say, where did they? Okay.
Where do they get that? That's the question.
Well,
Where's their textual proof of that? They don't have any. Arbitrary. Oh, there's the word.
Yeah.
so the answer where they get that is that Muhammad was said to have gone into a cave and meditated and then received revelation from an angel.
Gabriel, they actually claim.
Yeah, so it's the same notion as the Mormons that an angel revealed it to. And I'm like, well, I don't dispute that, but I will dispute which angel it was. It was one of those fallen varieties.
Yeah.
And
Gabriel? What?
Yeah, they Gabriel.
Sure.
Gabriel is
Sure.
how they say it. That's what they claim. Of course,
no, it was not
it
Gabriel.
was not Gabriel.
It was not Gabriel.
But other beliefs.
Certain of that.
See, Mary and Miriam are the same woman? No, they're not. They deny the deity of Christ very explicitly.
Oh yeah.
They say that Jesus is not God, neither the Son of God, because God doesn't have a son, which is confusing biology, biogenesis with order. The Quran denies the deity of Jesus and calls him a mere prophet only. They also claim that the Trinity is the teaching of three gods when the Bible teaches no such thing. Christians, with regard to our doctrine of God, at the top of the list is monotheism. We believe there is but one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. Very important. So, having said all of those things, we need to remember about Deuteronomy chapters 13 and 18. You see, this is helpful too because they technically accept the law of Moses. Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the law of Moses. And since they accept that, the law tells us that future revelation must be measured by previous revelation. And if so-called later revelation has conflicts with previous revelation, what necessarily must happen? It's not revelation. You ditch it. Gone. Goodbye. It's heretical. Which is, and I'll say this a few times this afternoon, so if the Quran is true, then it's not. You can't, that's a contradiction. Inconsistency. Oh, there's another one of those words. It keeps coming up.
Well, and the fact that they hold Jesus as a prophet, and the Quran specifically denies the crucifixion, and Jesus prophesied his crucifixion. So either Jesus is not a prophet,
More.
You see, that denial in Surah 4:157 just ruins them so badly.
Yeah.
I have to mention one of them to be demonstrated historically and inside and outside the Bible. All of Jesus' prophecies about it.
and there are numerous. And
Tons.
then there's the whole idea where Deuteronomy 18 talks about if a prophet speaks and what he says doesn't come true, then he's not a prophet.
Yeah.
So I mean, if they're willing to accept the Pentateuch as authoritative, then they've just destroyed the Quran.
Does Islam, or really any of these religions that we've talked about, I wondered if they sometimes, when they come across something that they don't understand or seems to be contradictory between whether it's different books that they accept or just different accepted teachings, do they ever just point to sort of like the unknowability of certain things? Like, well, we just don't know that, and that's fine. Like, we accept that we just can't know that. Or do they have a very strange answer that just doesn't, that they just, no, we won't talk about this, any
I
further?
suppose it would depend on who you ask and what you're talking about. If you're going to be talking about the contradictions like we've just been discussing, eventually they're going to play the same card that the Mormons play. We'll use have a corrupt text.
That's
They'll
what
do that. That's the oldest trick of the book. We just have the wrong Bible. Oh, do I? We'll get to that here in a minute.
Well, that's where you just say, okay, well then show me how to tell where it's wrong, and then that's what I've always said to him. And there was a young man who I was meeting with, who was a member of, he was one of my class students right before COVID hit, and he was a Muslim, and he would stay after class for half an hour, 45 minutes every week, and we would be talking. And these are some of the answers that he gave me, and I gently posed these things to him, and he was very thoughtful about it. It was going so well, and then COVID happened, and I didn't see him after that because he dropped the class and it all went online anyway. But it was like, man,
You got all sorts of cool opportunities with that class.
oh yeah, it is. That was a really cool one because he was like, oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, it was every week he would come in and it was like that. So.
We're going to think about some of these other things too, like this. According to the Quran, Allah is perfectly transcendent. and nothing in human experience can be likened to him. Surah 112:4. Well, anybody see a problem already? This would necessarily include things like human language, as everything in human language is related to and based on human experience. So, therefore, nothing in human language can correctly describe Allah. What's the Quran then? It's in human language.
Or for that matter, what's the Pentateuch?
Any of them.
Or any.
What's your claim? It's like, if you're going to say nothing in human language can accurately describe Allah because he's that transcendent. Now, as Christians, we are given the word of God through God's prophets and apostles, and it does accurately describe it. Is God beyond what's been described? Absolutely. But is he at least what's been described? Also absolutely. So this isn't a problem, of course, for Christians with the one true God, but they're going to say something like that, then you have a serious problem since you have a book.
I feel as Christians have also been told not to create a graven image of him, for fear that it would lead to worship of the image and not the deity.
Because God is transcendent.
Right.
But God is also immanent, i.e. Jesus.
And I mean, you see that reflected in the way that people are like, people say white Jesus and stuff like that, where they say that your Jesus is blue-eyed, fair skin, perfect hair, and stuff like that picture that you have.
Right. There are two things about that. First of all, obviously, we know good and well Jesus wasn't white. Okay, he was a Palestinian Jew. He would have looked like that. But secondly, think about the people that would have created those images in the first place. Think about the time periods, i.e. the Middle Ages, when the average person wouldn't go more than about 10 miles in any direction for his whole life. All they knew were people around them that looked like the people in this room. With the arts about King David, for example, you have art from that time period where King David looks like a knight in a medieval castle. Why? Because of course that's how kings looked. It's all the ones we know looked.
Yeah.
They had no idea.
There's a whole study on like the entire culture of Egypt, like ancient Egypt, about how you look at all kinds of documents, like everyone's white.
And you're like,
wait a minute.
that can't be.
This is
That's
making
all
me-
they knew.
Continent is Africa.
You see, some people these days, it's like, well, they're just so racist. It's like, no, they just didn't know.
Yeah.
They were completely
They
ignorant.
never considered.
Your
Yeah.
consideration of racism is exceptionally anachronistic because they just had no idea. Now we can communicate with someone all the way around the world, but this could be doing that right now on the other side of the planet. Someone could be watching what we're doing instantly. That's unheard of in the history of the world. But anyway, now we're getting sidetracked. That was a fun sidetrack. Shifting gears. All right. So the Quran. What is it then? Here's the thing. If you believe the Quran, then it can't be what it says it is. So you must disbelieve it. It refutes itself in this regard. Internal critiques show how it's inconsistent, as that does. The Quran has to go. And that is by their own standard with regard to previous revelation, for one. It contradicts itself. It is inconsistent, and something that is contradictory or inconsistent can't be the foundation for anything, much less an all-encompassing worldview. Which again is why when we started the class this afternoon, we don't just say we have our Bible, we have your Quran, we're just going to sit here on ivory towers and yell curses at one another. No, your book and your foundation is on thin air. It's contradictory, it's inconsistent, it can't be the foundation for anything. This really does refute the Quran, and we don't need to do it by claiming that our team is better than theirs, that we're good and they stink and need deodorant or something in effect. What we do is show that their refutation comes from their own material. It's an internal critique. Internal critiques are very devastating, provided they work, and they work with everything except for the Christian worldview. But there is going to be pushback, like I mentioned. What they're going to tell you, as I mentioned moments ago, the Bible is corrupted. The Bible you have is corrupted. You have the wrong version, the wrong translation, the wrong documents. You see, Allah gave Muhammad the ability to correct previous revelation, and that can be. So the Quran corrects the Bible, huh? So we have a bad version based on errant documents. That's right. Sounds like the Mormons that we talked about, right? The Bible is true as far as it can be translated correctly. That's good, isn't it? Sure is. It's an old trick, and it isn't any more meaningful in the mouth of a Muslim than in the mouth of a Mormon. And all you have to do is ask this question. Kip alluded to it earlier. Where's your evidence about those other manuscripts, other versions of the Bible? Because we have a serious amount of manuscript information, textual evidence of the Bible, Old and New Testament, especially the New Testament. Go to csntm.org, CSNTM. the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts.org. You will be blown away at the research that they've been doing and the amount of stuff that they don't digitize, just put up online. It's glorious. We have evidence, and guess what? Nothing in there that says what you're claiming. So where's your evidence? Of course, how much will they be able to provide? Empty set, nothing. And if you have no evidence, but are making a claim anyway, that is arbitrary. You can't demonstrate it. It's just your claim. I can assert the opposite claim. Intellectually nonsensical. But what they said, they say you need to trust the Quran and the Hadith to correct the Bible. Why? You just have to do it. No, that's arbitrary. We don't want to pay attention to that. We have no obligation to pay attention to that. Muslims may try to respond still by claiming the Quran is superior because it doesn't have any variant readings. They claim there are no variants in the Quran.
There's a reason for that.
Well, it's also not true.
That's true.
It's not true. They claim a reason for it, but you know what the palimpsest manuscripts are? You might not. Most Muslims don't know what they are, but they exist. The palimpsest manuscripts of the Quran we have are where they had some paper vellum or whatever. Was it paper vellum? They wrote on it, but they decided they want to write part of the Quran on it, so they wash the ink off, and then they write over it. Or the part of it are previous indications of the Quran in some of these palimpsest manuscripts, and you have new text over the top. But if you examine it carefully, you can see previous writing on it. It's not always the same. Not always the same. Oops! You do have variants. You do have a textual history. You just don't want to talk about it or try to ignore it. So we have the palimpsest manuscripts, but with regard to the modern Quran, okay, how did we get it? We have something called the Uthmanic revision. We like to call it that. They don't really like to call it that. But here's what happened. First of all, one of the points Muslim apologists make, like I said, they don't believe there are any variants in the Quran. We have lots of variants in the Bible. We aren't ashamed of this. We don't try to hide it. You see footnotes in your text. He talked about one this morning. It's there. We have a textual history. But in all that textual history, not a single doctrine in the scripture is affected by it. So we know what the textual variants are in the Bible. We know about textual criticism. We know where they come from. No doctrine in scripture is affected. But with regard to Islam, they say no variants like this exist. Okay, well, why? Well, let's talk about how they got their Quran. That's how they claim. Muhammad, like he said, they would often go into caves. He'd go into religious ecstasy, probably the result of epileptic seizures. People would talk about that he would have those kind of fits from time to time. But he would somehow get supposed revelations from Allah, and he would have to write them down quickly. Where do they write it? Well, sometimes they wrote them on pretty crude materials, bones, leaves, sticks, papyrus if it's available. But the prophet is speaking, quick, write it on something. People didn't carry reams of paper around with them. Didn't exist, reams of paper. That's another one of those modern cool things. You buy 500 sheets of this beautiful, pristine writing material. Didn't exist. But at one point, they were going to have to bring all of this together and make a book out of it. All the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. So when they decided to do this, which was sometime after Muhammad's death in 630, there were some disagreements about what the Prophet said and what he didn't. What do we do about this? Well, in the third caliphate, there's that word again, remember? The caliph is considered the socio-political religious ruler of Islam, the successor of Muhammad. And again, no official caliphate exists today. But his name is Uthman. Uthman. He called in all the various translations and all the various variations that they had. And bring them in here upon pain of death if you don't. There's some motivation for you. And anything that didn't agree with what he considered to be the official record were destroyed. So, there's no Islamic miracle of a variant-free book. Rather, on threat of execution, back at the time of Uthman, all the variant readings they were aware of at the time were destroyed. Islam has a history of violence to promote itself, don't forget. Violence that is consistent with its own teaching. And this is part of how it happened. No miracle, just a threat of violence. Again, we have the example of the unbeliever hanging himself because he cannot keep his story straight. So you mean to tell me, Mr. Muslim, that I'm supposed to trust that you have the original of what Muhammad claimed was from God after what Uthman did? How do you know Uthman did it right? There's our question.
Because Uthman was not considered a prophet, correct?
Uthman was a caliph, so he was the one in charge.
Right.
But no, not considered a prophet.
Yeah.
But
Because
so
even if they could say that Muhammad was granted the ability to revise other things, they can't.
they can't vouch for the
Say they
100%
can't.
perfection
Yeah.
work of Uthman.
Yeah.
They can't.
Yeah.
How do you know Uthman did it right? They don't know he did it right. They can't. And given what we know about man's nature in general, again, think like a Christian here, as we're supposed to, right? You think he might have possibly worked things to his own advantage, maybe just a little? Yes, of course he did. It's a sinful man with all that power. Unregenerate on top of that, right? Once again, they don't know. The claim reduces to arbitrariness. That's right. Why? Because Uthman did it. How do you know Uthman did it right? Well, he just did it. Say that again slowly. You don't know, do you? No, you don't. You just claim it. And given what was going on at the penalty of death to bring it all in, just maybe, this of course is assuming the entire historicity of the account in the first place. Anyway, Islam has a material inadequacy. Judaism does too. But it is this. The material inadequacy of Islam. Inadequacy. What do I mean by that? Islam cannot deal with the theology of the Old Testament. It doesn't deal with it. In many cases, it doesn't even try. What do I mean? What theology? This theology. The temple. Why was there a holy of holies, a holiest place? Why were there blood sacrifices? You affirm the law? Yeah. Leviticus. Why Leviticus? What's that pointing to? What's the purpose of it? They can't. Simply can't do it. But don't you affirm the previous revelation? The law of Moses? How does this work out? How does Islam deal with that? They don't. Oh, wait, that's a problem. Yeah, this is an internal critique. They claim the law of Moses. What do you do with it? Why? Did an animal have to give up its life to point toward a substitute for sins on behalf of sinners? Why? Why do we have the sign of circumcision? What did that point to? The descendant of Abraham who was to come, who was going to be the sacrifice, right? See, these things are part and parcel of the worldview of Islam. They claim the Old Testament, at least the law, is part of their authoritative tradition, but
It's like the Quran is just an ad hoc addition to the whole thing, right? So there's no continuity between testaments, quote unquote.
on the other hand, when you read the New Testament, you can't separate it from the Old Testament. It is filled with theological references and quotes and allusions to the Old Testament because they work like this. That's why it's revelation from God again, showing the fulfillment.
Oh, read Hebrews.
Read Hebrews.
Revelation.
Revelation arguably has more allusions in some way, not quotations, but allusions to the Old Testament than it has verses.
Right.
404, someone speculated. It's just amazing.
Everywhere.
You cannot separate the New Testament from the Old. The Quran's like, where did that come from? But don't you claim it? We do. Where's the discussion of it? Where's the interaction with it? Where's the fulfillment of it? I hear crickets. But they do not live in light of the Old Testament. They don't even understand it. They certainly don't see how it's all fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ, God overall. By the way, I say that a lot. You know why I say that a lot? I say that a lot because of Romans 9:5.
They don't believe in the crucifixion. The Old Testament points to the crucifixion.
Yes.
everywhere. So
Yeah.
That's
that's
another
the misunderstanding here. I mean,
Psalms.
That's just it. Yeah, Psalm 22, right? The Song of the Cross. Hello?
Yeah, it's like you read that. I remember reading that at one Easter service. And Mike Frankie came up to me afterwards. He said, you were reading that, and I didn't hear what you're referencing, and it sounded like you're just reading out of the New Testament. I'm like, well, yeah, I get
His
it.
point is valid.
Yeah.
He's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Because that's how intimate the relationship is between the Old and the New Testaments. Quran has nothing like that. But yes, Jesus, God overall, forever praised. And Romans 9:5, to them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God overall, blessed forever. Amen. You see, Islam falls apart, just like any other false worldview. On its own information, internal critique, take it apart from the inside. Go into the opponent's worldview and wreak havoc. Run it through the A.I.C.P.
That just demonstrates it's a creaturely production.
Yes.
Whether it's created by a demon or whether it's created by Muhammad, it's just of the imagination of some creature.
It's why I said when we were getting to the beginning of this, when the objection comes in, when you're apologetic, it works for atheism. How does it work for religious worldviews? Because it's just another one of man's worldviews. It just has a religious tinge to it. Maybe it was demonically influenced, almost certainly was. But at the end of the day, it's going to have inconsistencies, contradictions. It's going to be arbitrary. It's going to be false claims. It can't justify itself because it comes from the mind of man. It does not come from God.
Clearly doesn't.
And that takes apart Islam. It's Why do they still believe it? Sin is more powerful of a blinder on the eyes than people want to give it credit to. Kelly and I were talking about this earlier on before we started class. That when you've been a Christian for a long time, and you've had your eyes opened by the grace of God, you see things clearly, even more clearly as your life goes on, the truth of God. Sometimes you forget what you were like before you were saved. And you're like, wow, I really was there. That was me. Yes, it was. God has opened our eyes, and it's glorious. Now, questions for discussion. Joseph Smith. Let's talk about him again for a minute. He found the golden plates that became the Book of Mormon. How do you do that?
I got drunk.
I bet.
He didn't.
He didn't do it. But the story is, he got this vision from God, and he went into the woods, and he found this spot where these plates were, and this angel, what was my angel's name? Moroni.
Moron.
I am a moron.
Angel Moroni, but he couldn't take the plates. He had to come back, I think, the same time after 4 years. Eventually, he was allowed to take them.
Yeah, he was trying to figure out which denomination to join.
Don't join any of them.
He prayed about it. And yeah,
I'm just like a 17, 18-year-old young man at this point, too. Anywho, how does the requirement that the Bible is the Word of God only when it's translated correctly affect critiquing Mormon church doctrine?
Because it becomes malleable.
Yeah, it's malleable, and it's like, okay, this is kind of the trump card, so to speak.
It's a
Oh,
really
you have something that I don't like, or doesn't agree with my Mormon teaching. Oh, well, the Bible must not be translated correctly.
Yeah.
Very convenient out.
Yeah.
To which we ask the question, how do you know that? Do you have any proof that it wasn't translated correctly? Do you have another version with manuscripts that I'm not taking into account that can demonstrate that this is wrong? Well, no. Arbitrary. Fail. That really is the end of it. If you run into arbitrariness, game over. The person who's arbitrary loses every time. The Quran. How did it come into being? The Quran is considered what? One of the primary, but one of 4 accepted inspired works that for the religion of Islam. The Quran, there are also the Hadith. Don't forget the Hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih al-Muslim, Sahih sayings of that. Basically, those are the sayings of the Prophet that were recorded, and sometimes they're so awful, but they believe them to be information also from the Prophet, but outside of the Quran. But they accept the Quran, the Law of Moses, the Psalms of David, the Gospel of Jesus. So how did it come into being? Well, they claim that Muhammad went into a cave and got visions. The angel Jabril sometimes spoke to him, gave it to him. Islam believes the Quran is eternal, that it's always existed. It's just being revealed to Muhammad verbatim. Their doctrine, I mentioned this before, I'm sorry, I should have said this. It's basically dictation. It's not like what we have in our doctrine of inspiration. The only similarities that is the belief of inerrancy. But you can tell Paul's style of writing from Peter's style of writing, from Moses' style of writing. If you look at the documents, it's there in the text. But according to Islam, you don't have that. You have it dictated word for word exactly from Allah to
So
Muhammad.
then why did they need to do the big cleanup?
That's a fair question. But that's the other part of the answer, right? Like, why do you need
Because
this?
they believe, like, no, this was straight from.
Ask that question. That's the one that would be good to get an answer from that. But of course, then you have the Uthmanic revision, which you're referring to, which comes about afterwards. Islam's 5 major doctrines. You have the 5 doctrines, the 5 pillars, or the 6 pillars. You have Allah, who's the one God, right? You have Muhammad, who's the latest and greatest of the prophets. Kismet gets tacked on to the end, which is another word for fate or fatalism. Yes, very good. You have, I'm not very trying to remember all myself, and I just went over this.
Pray 5 times towards Mecca.
That's one of the pillars. Pray 5 times a day towards Mecca.
Practice almsgiving.
Almsgiving.
Fasting during Ramadan.
Ramadan, which is a lunar month, so it moves to going on right now, actually.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Jihad is the 6th one with an asterisk.
Yes.
Technically, jihad can't happen unless you have
A caliph.
a caliph or caliph, yes. Though, and there hasn't been an official caliph or caliphate ruler over all Islam for a very long time. If that ever gets declared, look out. That's going to be World War III, probably.
There is a special term that they use for jihad in areas where they are not the majority, and it's akin to our evangelism. And basically the idea is that you lie until you gain power, and then, to gain favor so that you gain power, and then you can go and take over with the sword.
I'm not sure how all that works. With regard to evangelism, if you're actually trying to talk to people about the truth of Allah in the Quran, I believe it's called dawah is the term they use for that. But that's not the same as what you were discussing. I'm not sure.
No, it's considered to be a part of, or a type of jihad.
It's like a tactic.
What's that?
It's like a tactic,
Yeah.
basically. Like if you can't do this, this
Yeah.
is another acceptable way.
And it's not they prescribe you to lie. It's okay to lie. It's sort of the Sun Tzu thing. All warfare is deception, sort of thing.
Well, deception is part of warfare.
Well,
Absolutely.
sure it is.
So if you're lying to people, you're at war with them. Keep that in mind. I remember, right?
because Islam prohibits lying, but then it says it's okay in this context. And so anyway,
Well,
forget the name of it. There's
I can say this: you have in the Quran two different kinds of surahs that are written depending on where Muhammad was at the time, as the tradition goes. You have the Medinan sermons where he was living in Medina, and then you have the Meccan surahs. One when he was an outcast, i.e. Mecca, when he was there in the religious minority, then you kind of have what you were talking about, the peaceful, maybe try to subvert things, try to win people quietly, don't cause any big stirs. But then when he fled to Medina, that's when he raised his army, and he was the one in charge of the religious political system. And those are much more warlike surahs. So the idea is, well, and you'll have some Muslims who will say this. It's like, are you living in Mecca or Medina? That's a valid question.
yes.
You'll get a different answer depending on whether he's living in Saudi Arabia or Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Takia.
Tequila.
Taqiya.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking
Is the
here.
practice of dissimulation and secrecy of religious belief and practice primarily in Shia Islam.
Okay. That also might be why I haven't heard of it. Shia, Sunnis and Shiites are the two biggest, but they're not.
She's a
compared.
minority. Yeah.
Shiite Islam is a significant minority. I think 85 to 90% of the Muslims in the world will call themselves Sunni Muslims. And Shiite is about 7%, maybe 7 8%. And the remainder is a mix of various groups like Sufis
Yeah, Sufi mystics.
and a few mystic shirts. I don't even know all the names of the various groups. But Sunni is the most important, and most of your Muslims are going to be Sunni Muslims. According to Islam, did Jesus die on the cross? No. Surah 4157 explicitly denies it. Most Muslims believe that Judas was crucified instead. Some, including the fairly well-known debater Shabir Ali, believe that Jesus was put on the cross, but he didn't die. He was resuscitated. He was actually on the cross. He didn't actually get killed. So that is a very minority position, but it does exist. It's out there. Other beliefs that Muslims have that contradict the Bible. What are some of the ones we talked about? Big. Denial of the crucifixion is a big deal.
Well, I mean, obviously the Unitarian nature of God,
As opposed to the Trinitarian nature of God.
right?
Jesus' mother.
Yeah, Mary and Miriam are the same person.
Yeah.
No, Surah 19, you read that and you just kind of shake your head. Like, this is embarrassing. There's also something else I didn't talk about, but I mentioned it in a sermon a few weeks ago. There's something called the Arabic Infancy Gospel that was written about the time that Muhammad was living, and it records some apocryphal and false things that happened to Jesus. For example, speaking from the cradle. And the Quran makes reference to that.
Oh, it cites it.
Yeah, it doesn't cite it, but it claims that it was authentic. It's like, no, it wasn't. That had nothing to do with it. We throw that up against John 2:11, where it says that the miracle of the water into wine at the wedding in Cana of Galilee was the, quote, first arche of his signs. If that was the first one, he didn't speak from the cradle. He also didn't make birds in that acclaim to bring them to life, which is also claimed in the Quran, also in the Arabic Infancy Gospel. So there's another contradiction for you. But don't you believe the gospel? Yeah, so we have the Gospel of John. You gave me the gospel of Jesus. John's part of that, so what do we have? Another contradiction. But your text was corrupted. I already know how to respond to that. Show me.
Corrupted. That's so many contradictions.
That's why they say it. It's not a new thing, but anyway. This is useful. That book is extremely helpful. I recommend it. I've read it. I should need to read it again. What every Christian needs to know about the Quran, Dr. James R. White, the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries. He has done more to debate publicly various forms of unbelief, probably more than any person in the history of the world, largely because of the fact that you can move around the world these days. He has done 197 moderated public debates, not radio debates. He doesn't count those. If he's a couple of them that he's done over the internet using Zoom or something, but they're moderated and they're on public display. Most of the ones he's done are in person, in a room, 2 to 3 hours, sometimes longer, with a moderator and going back and forth, opening statements, rebuttals, questions, those kind of debates. And he has debated multiple Muslims in various places around the world: London, Sydney, South Africa, and across the United States. This is a very good book. White does not write books from an ivory tower. He writes them so that people like us can understand them and actually be able to use them in the defense of the faith and be able to respond to unbelief. James White is where I first started learning presuppositional apologetics, actually. And his ministry, Alpha and Omega Ministries, is very much worth your attention. He also now serves as one of the elders at Apologia Church in Phoenix, alongside Jeff Durbin, Apologia Studios. We talked about them already. So that is the book, and that's the end of the Islam discussion. Now I want to justify the ultimate proof that we've been using, because we really haven't officially done that. We talked about it's absurd to be arbitrary and inconsistent, things like that, but we talked about the fact that nothing escapes the analysis of A.I.C.P. Absolutely nothing escapes it. But why? Why does nothing escape it? Well, it's absurd to be arbitrary. Yes, it is. Why? It's like the laws of logic. You can't be illogical. You're right, but why do the laws of logic exist? This is a kicker. When I realized this, it absolutely blew me away. It gave me more confidence in my own faith, more confidence than I've ever had before. Write this down. We maintain the only way you can truly have knowledge is because of God. And even an understanding of truth requires God and his revelation that he's given to us. Not just in general revelation, but the complete revelation of God that he's given us, that he wanted us to have in the scriptures. We maintain that the whole package of the Bible, the whole Christian faith, and its certain foundation, that of God himself and his word, the Bible, is what gives the whole procedure of A.I.C.P. meaning in the first place. That's what does it. Every step in the A.I.C.P. process is a reflection and application of the Christian worldview. For example, why can't we be arbitrary? Well, it becomes absurd. Yes, but why? It's because of the Christian worldview. Only God has the authority to speak for himself. I can't just claim something and it's automatically true. I have to have justification for it. I have to have good reason for it. God has his own reason. God can't be arbitrary, you see. We can't just say whatever we want. We do not have that kind of authority. We don't have that kind of knowledge. Only God has that kind of knowledge, and therefore we conform our thinking to him. Goes the reason. I don't know what that was. Something popped outside. Anyway, the unbeliever, were he to be consistent with his position, would have to say, think of an atheist saying this, that people can be arbitrary and they have a right to be arbitrary because there's no God. And you're just saying that people can't be arbitrary because you think that your God is the authority and you can't speak against it.
So what?
Okay, yeah, so what?
So what's wrong with me?
Yeah, so he ends up refuting himself. We talked about this before. If you're arbitrary, all I have to do is say, so what? Or push back with the opposite claim. The absurdity of arbitrariness is easily shown to be such. We've demonstrated it over and over again. You may be able to show this in some of your conversations already. But why is it absurd? Because God speaks for himself. Because he has this authority and knowledge. Only he has that authority and knowledge. So to be arbitrary doesn't work for anyone else. That's why it reduces to absurdity. You've seen it in conversations. How about the next one? Why can't we be inconsistent? You know what I'm going to say at the first is because of the Christian worldview. We serve the sovereign God who cannot lie, who cannot, but that word, I didn't just say may not or does not. I said cannot contradict himself. When you say cannot in the same sentence as God, you have to be careful. Very careful. But there are some things that God cannot do. That's one of them.
And we know that because he says it.
Because he said so.
Yeah.
He told us. The text of 2 Timothy 2:13, if we're faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God can't deny himself. Which is why you can't have contradictions. God can't deny himself. He can't make himself into something that he's not. He is a certain way. He cannot unbecome. He cannot contradict himself. All the foundational laws from logic flow from God himself because of who he is and how he's made things. There cannot be inconsistencies and contradiction in God. There simply can't be. He made a world. and a universe that reflects himself. To insist on contradiction, therefore, is to be absurd, and it is absurd. You cannot have contradiction in this world. It simply doesn't work. That's why it doesn't work.
It's not absurd in other worldviews.
But it
An
shouldn't be.
inconsistency. Oh, well, yeah, because we don't live in other worlds.
Yep, we don't live in another world.
So yeah.
Why this world? Because God.
Yeah.
Why the laws of logic? Why do they work this way? Because God. They reflect his nature. The law of non-contradiction. Therefore, there is no logic without the one true God. If the unbeliever denies logic, then he doesn't. Remember that? That's what happens if you reject the standard of inconsistency. You reject logic, you get absurdity. I really meant to when I heard all the way back at the beginning when you say the Christian worldview, there really isn't anything that can stand against it. You cannot raise your hand against it. You try, you end up looking ridiculous because of this. Why is it important to consider, again, that's important, that's a fun thing to say. But anyway, why is it important to consider consequences of a worldview? Where that worldview ends up? Consequences. Well, you knew that was coming. It's because of the Christian worldview. We believe that cause and effect are related to each other. We live in a universe where this is the case because God has ordered it this way. This is God's world. This is God's universe. Cause and effect are real things. There are consequences for actions. Jesus said that we can know a tree by its fruit, right? The consequences of the tree, you're going to get a certain kind of fruit from it. Luke 6:43 through 45. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good. An evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. You get consequences from the tree. It produces what it produces because it's that kind of tree. The unbeliever, if you were consistent, would try to deny necessary consequences then, because that's a Christian position to insist on necessary consequences. So what happens if you deny necessary consequences? Oh, you get absurdity, or you end up getting yourself killed. They necessarily follow. This is God's world. You can't get that position. These things really do happen. And furthermore, the truck will eventually kill him. I've used this illustration several times. You know what I'm saying. If the unbeliever, he can claim anything that he wants. Pay the bills on the claim. Walk out in the street. The truck will hit you. You won't die. Yes, I will. Oh, you mean there are necessary consequences? Laws of physics, things like that? Yeah, you know that there are. You can claim anything you want, but you don't live that way. You can claim that when it's cold outside, you can walk outside without your coat on and not be cold, but you can claim that to my face, but when you stand up from your chair, you're going to put your coat on and walk out the door. Because you don't live in the world you claim, you live in my God's world. There are necessary consequences. No coat equals cold. It follows. And of course, we've talked about the don't answer method. Very, very important from Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. If you're going to memorize scriptures, those are good ones to do. We'll talk about those again here next week as we review various examples. And we talked about the preconditions of intelligibility. Oh, we know that they all flow from the Christian worldview, every single one of them. There are a bunch of them. We'll be told that we're just assuming God is the precondition for all intelligibility. Well, to be told that while they argue about these preconditions. Well, of course we're assuming that God is the precondition of intelligibility. If we're not assuming that, then will we really believe that he is the foundation for those things? Come on. We're not saying that God is the precondition everywhere except when you're talking about God and his authority. No. He is needed even to begin that discussion because we only have logic that's intelligible and meaningful because the one true God who cannot deny himself. Now, the accusation from an unbeliever who's being astute. Just the last slide. Oh, yes. The accusation from an unbeliever who's being astute, having heard all this, will be that you, as the Christian, are begging the question. You're using a method that's derived from your worldview to analyze all the others. You're begging the question. Okay, is he right? Yes and no. We're using a method derived from our worldview. He's right about that. No, we're not begging the question. Remember we were talking about that particular logical fallacy? If you're talking about your ultimate authority, where everything stops, you must assume it, and that it governs everything else. An ultimate authority must prove itself. Because if you measure the ultimate standard for something by something else, that something else becomes the ultimate standard. It has to prove itself by the impossibility of the contrary, by transcendental argumentation that we've talked about before. You might recall the eyeball illustration. You use your eyes to do research, to examine the reliability of your eyes. You can't get away from it, which demonstrates they're reliable. You have to use your eyes in order to test it. We talked about laws of logic. Don't people have to assume the laws of logic in order to argue against them? Yes, they do. So by doing so, even to try to argue against it, you demonstrate the truth of the laws of logic. In a much greater way, God is needed even to begin to have an idea about the intelligibility of the process of examination in the first place. You must always assume an ultimate authority or even just a single presupposition before you can analyze it, test it, and critique it. You have to assume it first to do an internal critique on it. That's what you do with the don't answer method. Okay, I don't believe that there's a God. Okay, I'm a Christian, so I do believe there's a God. So no, that's not right. But what would naturally follow, for the sake of argument, if we assume presupposition that there is no God? What happens? What do you get? What are the consequences of that? So that's what you're doing. You're assuming it for the sake of argument and then showing how it destroys itself from the inside. You always have to assume an ultimate authority or presupposition before you can analyze it, test it, or critique it. Very important. Christianity, that is, the triune God of Scripture and the Bible he gave us, is true by the impossibility of the contrary. If you throw it out, and thus you throw out A.I.C.P., all you get is unintelligible absurdity. Skepticism and subjectivism. Skepticism, subjectivism. That's what we're talking about. Too many isms. That's what you get. Nobody knows, or I just have my own ideas, or absurdity is fine, but no one really actually believes any of those things because they don't live like it. You don't know anything as he sits down in the chair and eats the food that he picked up from Taco Bell on the way here, right? Aren't you eating? I have my own ideas about everything as he stops at the traffic light for the vehicles to pass by. I mean, seriously, it's that simple. People can sound all philosophically intelligent and make these kind of claims, but all you got to do is watch them walk out the door, drive down the road, go through Taco Bell, which immediately knows that they weren't having a very good day. But
Or they won't have.
they won't have a good day. Taco Bowel, right?
Yeah.
But in any case, you see the point. If we reject A.I.C.P., all we get is foolishness. You need these principles to be intelligible about anything, which means you need the truth of the Christian worldview to be intelligible about anything. The Christian worldview is the precondition of A.I.C.P. We should get hats. I have a scrolling marquee hat that I used when I was running for office. I can't find it though. I can program with A.I.C.P. or something and have it up. That was so much fun. That would look great. Anyway, unbelievers might claim that they don't want to use the A.I.C.P. for themselves or be subjected to it or anything because they're Christian standards, but in order to be reasonable or rational, they have to. In so doing, they hang themselves because they have to use Christian principles to fight Christianity, demonstrating that Christianity is true. You have to use the laws of logic to argue against logic. It means they're true. This is the ultimate proof of your faith, and it is irrefutable. As Van Til said, using it as an illustration, in order for the child to slap his father in the face, the father has to let him sit on his lap. When someone rejects Jesus, they reject logic, they reject intelligibility, morality, everything else that's needed for us to function in this world. And it's because it's God's world, and there's no way around it. The truth of the Bible is needed even to make sense out of the sentence I just uttered. The reality of our God is needed to account why someone's thinking about anything. A.I.C.P. itself only makes sense in the light of the Christian worldview, and therefore it follows that from this that literally everything is proof of our God. People don't like it when I say that, but it's true. I can prove God from anything. Anything. I don't care what it is. Literally everything, every thought, every concept, every action, every material thing, every word, everything, including our reasoning, is proof of our God. Reasoning itself is a tool by which we get around in this world, and the ability to reason itself, which we must do, which this course has largely been about, demonstrates that our God is. Reason never stands on its own, unaided, but it always bows to God. We believe in order to understand. Unaided reason can't prove anything. Reason itself must be accounted for, and we've accounted for it. That is a glorious thing. That's a short section. It really is irrefutable. Your position can't be true. Why? You can't be falsified. What you said be falsified. People say that. Let's talk about one other thing this evening. We should have enough time to talk about it. Because people raise various problems, bring various questions when it comes to apologetics, questions that they're going to encounter. What I'd like you to do is, any encounters that you have, you talk to anybody this week or the last few weeks, or you come up with various problems or things that we may not have covered in the course, think about those. Bring those to the table next week. Think about it over the week because we're going to have plenty of time to deal with it next week. And we're also going to go through several examples from Dr. Lyle's book and analyze those. And then buttress it with some of the response that he had. We're also going to talk about Jehovah's Witnesses for a few minutes because we didn't do that in the main corpus of the course. I'm writing up a brief thing on that because if someone's coming to your door, they're either going to be young men with white shirts, black ties, and name badges. They're probably going to be two ladies standing there and saying they want to be witnesses of Jehovah. So one of those two are probably coming to your door. They don't come to my door anymore. Well, they come once every 10 years. We get another batch, and then they blacklist us again.
They stand on the corners now.
The Jehovah's Witnesses very often stand on the corners. The Mormons don't typically. They usually go knocking on doors more often. But your Jehovah's Witnesses, they usually have their rolling stand with all the literature in it. The funny thing is that they used to do that over at the Kroger where we were yesterday. They don't do it as much anymore.
There was, I've seen them recently. Where was I?
A couple weeks before that, they were in the parking lot of just over Stop 11 in Madison over there.
They're on they're in Greenwood, on Main Street in Madison.
Yeah, I go to Craig Park a lot too, right where that trail comes down the
That's where it
hill.
was. We were
There's a
at,
batch at Illinois and Washington Street downtown too, underneath the bridge for the Surgeon
Yeah.
Center Mall. They hang up
Yeah.
there. So they're around.
so
And
go
we
and
will
get
talk
a
about
copy of everything they have on the stand, just so you can take it and burn it.
Yeah.
or
But
use it to do
Make
some
sure
of
no
your
one else
research.
can get it.
Now, they won't take anything from you. The Jehovah's Witnesses won't take anything from you. They will not accept literature from somebody else. They never have. I've always found it interesting. It's like, so I can take your stuff, yeah, but you're not willing to take anything from me and look at it? No.
I got some stuff in the mail from Sister Sarah.
Sister Sarah?
Jehovah.
Oh, okay. Well, bring it. Bring it. Ask questions. We'll talk about that as well.
Invite Sister
But-
Sarah to come to the class.
Sure, next week, come on over. We'll talk about it. And we'll talk about Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll talk about things like their failed 1914 prophecy, which is a huge embarrassment for them. We'll talk about
That's the only ones.
we'll talk about what they believe about Jesus, that he's the Archangel Michael, how their New World Translation is a transmutation in several places. We will talk about this, and we'll do an internal critique on them as well, and it will collapse just like everything else. But first, let's talk about this. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is perhaps the most persistent and pained challenge to the Christian message, the Christian worldview. At least it's perceived that way. Because we have suffering in this world. We have wickedness in this world. It's all around us. For some people, it is intense. That suffering people will claim is very much at odds with a statement of a God that is all good and benevolent to his creation. We see war, crime, murder, disease, and a host of other things in this world, do we not? Absolutely we do. We also see fear and hatred, infidelity, greed, lies, racial hostility, and that's just from people. In the natural world, we have crippling injuries, cancer, hurricanes, and earthquakes, stillborn children, infertility. And I could go on and on and on. It wouldn't be hard. So the question comes up, why is there so much misery? And particularly with regard to the actions of people, why is there so much injustice? Isn't God good? Why does it seem to be distributed in a seemingly unjust fashion? And then the question here, this is one that unbelievers will ask you, almost certainly, especially atheists. If it were left to us, would we make a world where there was such cruelty and misery? We. Penetrating question, isn't it? It's okay to say yes. I think it is.
Certainly would.
It is a penetrating question. And it's, depending on how they ask it, it could be a good question. Maybe they're just angry and just trying to rile you up. Maybe they're broken and hurt and want to know. Because most people who raise this objection, and us when we ask God the why question, there are people that have gone through great suffering themselves. They really have. Maybe they lost a loved one due to a cancer or a car accident. Michael Foster's wife was in a terrible accident this morning. She She came out pretty much unscathed, as the kids, but their van was totaled. Got a head-on collision down in Ohio. Thankfully, they're okay. Not the van, though. It was a mess. It was the fault of the other driver across the center line.
That was clearly evident.
Maybe they lost a loved one, car accident. Maybe they are not able to have children. Perhaps any number of things. It's always important to take into account the emotional distress that's involved in this question. This is not always an academic exercise when you slice and dice of atheist objections. It will be that, but it will be more. Because sometimes you're dealing with people who are truly hurting and want answers. People will ask about this with tears in their eyes. Believers will ask about this with tears in their eyes. And sometimes the believers will even know how to destroy the objections of unbelievers in the process when they ask this question. Having experienced one of these things, they'll come to your friend who just lost her husband. Suddenly, murdered in the street, and asking, why did I just suffer? If God really is in control, why do his own people suffer? Sometimes sharing our own sufferings, the injustices that we've suffered, the diseases that we've endured, that can be of help to people. We can identify and comfort them. After all, that's something the Bible tells us we're supposed to be able to do in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. With the comfort God has given us, we can comfort others. But King David suffered greatly. Read the Psalms. David wrote about half the Psalms, and he expresses some serious pain in some of those Psalms. Man after God's own heart, the greatest king Israel ever had, suffered grievously. Absalom, anybody? Evil in this world hurt him. Hurts us. Denying it is silly. It hurts. And finding out a few things about my favorite instructor with regard to philosophy and apologetics, from whom I've learned the most at the very least, present company accepted. Dr. Greg Bonson suffered a great deal in his own life. Arguably the greatest Christian apologist who's ever lived, endured a great deal of pain. His wife apostatized from the faith and left him. She was entirely unrepentant, and her family sided with her. He was a very sickly man. He was plagued with heart problems most of his adult life. He had an adult form of diabetes and required open stomach surgery once to correct problems, and 3 different open heart surgeries to correct life-threatening issues. The third such open heart surgery proved to be fatal. He died on the table at the age of 47 on December 11th, 1995. He wasn't an old man. How he produced as much as he did in his life astonished me, especially with all these ailments and the pain that he had from all these physical problems, from his wife's sin. But in the hundreds of hours I've listened to from him at this point, I've never once heard him complain about it. He talks about that he was a sinner undeserving of God's grace. It makes me mad. He trusted the God he knew to be good, and now he's enjoying his eternal reward. What's interesting as a side note, look this up on YouTube. We'll talk about an amazing sermon. The last sermon he preached to his church before going in for that last heart surgery, he knew he had to have it. He didn't think he was going to survive. He preached that sermon with that in mind. He preached his dying sermon. It's on YouTube. It's impressive. A dying man's dying man, quite literally. In any case, we're going to talk about answers for both kinds of people in this class session. For human evil, for natural evil. People that are trying to object to cause problems, people that are objecting to tears because they want to know why they're suffering. Something that we need to realize in this discussion, evil is serious. We insist upon that. The nature of evil is bad, it is real, it is ugly, it is terrible. We must not minimize that reality. So don't downplay that. But yes, this is evil. This is terrible. It's wicked. We hate it too. Bonson was on a religious radio program many years ago out in California. Dennis Prager's religious radio program, actually. And one night during the interview, Bonson was there with a couple of other panelists from different religions that were answering questions. Bonson was about loving and adoring God, worshiping him, delighting in God. And an irate caller got on the air and wanted to talk to him. He was very upset that Dr. Bonson would speak of adoring God. You see, this man, this caller, had just finished his service on jury duty service for a trial for a particularly brutal case of child molestation. And in the course of this trial, the jury, including him, had to examine pictures in this case. He saw unimaginable cruelty on top of the fact that the monster that they were trying did those things in the first place. He demanded to know from Dr. Bonson how anyone could worship a God that would allow such things to happen. On the air, no preparation, there's that call. What do you say?
How would you know what good is if you didn't know what evil was?
That's part of it. However, in a situation where someone is that torn and that grieved and that angry over evil, let's lead into that. What you said, it comes up. But let's lead into that. But you see what happened in the studio when that happened? All the other panelists, they backed away from their microphones. It's like, fires, Dr. Bonson. Okay, here's the thing. It was good for this man to be so indignant about this evil that had taken place. Make no mistake, it was a grievous, terrible evil that had occurred. Call it what it is. Dr. Bonson asked the man if that terrible crime made him angry. He passionately affirmed that it did make him angry. Bonson said, good, it makes me angry too. I mean, such a thing makes you angry, doesn't it? Should. Makes me angry. You're going to do things like that to a child. If I see you doing it, you're not going to have a chance to see the police. You're still streaming. YouTube. Never mind. No, actually, not. People bringing up the problem of evil. They bring it up as something they want to condemn, and you are going to want to condemn it too, and that's good, because God condemns those kinds of things. Before I finish the story, though, about this radio call and how Dr. Bonson answered it, let's lay this problem out specifically. Philosophically, the problem of evil is listed like this. We believe that God is all good, and we do. Everything he does is good. He's the source of good. We believe that he's all powerful. He can do anything he wants. There's no limit to God's power. Also, true, real, and terrible evil does exist in this world. Yes, it does. And now come the objections. You probably already think about what some of them are. The objection is raised, if God is all good, then he wouldn't want evil to exist. They say. And if he were all powerful, then he would just get rid of it. So, either God isn't good, or he's not all powerful. There's the philosophical problem that's presented. That's the logical problem. You see how the logical problem goes through there. If God is all powerful, then evil would not exist. Evil does exist. Therefore, God is not all powerful. That's modus tollens.
We're not all good. Or it doesn't exist.
Right, or rearrange it in whichever way. You can arrange it. That's formal logic. That's a valid syllogism, a valid argument. It's not a sound one. But that's how it goes. So what do we do with this objection? What do we do with it? This is what we do with it. You know what we do with it. That's what we do with it. It's time for A.I.C.P. Every time. Every time. Is this an arbitrary consideration? Are there inconsistencies in this objection? What are the consequences of thinking like this? What are the preconditions of intelligibility that we can understand what evil is in the first place? So let's go there. Let's do it. For whom really is evil? Logical problem, by the way. Tony touched on this. It's an issue for the Christian or the non-Christian. Which one? It's an issue for the non-Christian. It should be obvious upon reflection that the unbeliever cannot urge the problem of evil against us unless he has the right to assert there's such a thing as evil in the first place. If there cannot be such a thing as evil, then attacking us with the concept of evil is meaningless, which creates consequences you don't want given the illustration that we've already started to provide. That C shows up in bright color. And we'll talk more about it here as we go through it. Because it's crucial to the unbeliever's case to be able to assert the existence of evil and to evaluate something as evil. Child molestation is evil, capital E, evil. But by what standard does he consider something to be? What are the presuppositions by which he makes any moral judgments at all? We've talked about this. Not as wrapped in emotion as a situation like this is. But you can't let go of part of the reason I wanted to use an illustration like this is because when emotional, gripping, horrible things happen, you're moved by it. We're not passions. But you need to have the proper epistemological foundation in the truth of the Word of God before you start dealing with the emotions, lest the emotional manipulation come in and swerve you away from the truth. Watch for that. That will be used against you.
Absolutely.
It will. And frankly, at the risk of sounding sexist, and I don't care because it's true because of how women are, and it's a good way that you were made this way, but it's easier for women to be swayed by that than it is men. Because of your relational nature. I mean, how many times have you talked to men? It's like, don't you feel anything? Huh? You've run into that frustration talking to us sometimes. Well, that has its defects, but it also has the added effect of making us more immune to stuff like that. But we're not completely immune to it. And when this kind of evil happens, we get angry. We should. But that anger ought not control how we decide whether something is good or evil, or how to argue with the unbeliever in the process. Now, let's see, which one am I on? Here we go. Maybe the unbeliever sees evil as something that invokes public disapproval. This would invoke public disapproval. The illustration we gave, right? So good would be that which would invoke public approval then. But if that's the case, the following statement would always be senseless. Public approval is something that's good. Public disapproval is something that's evil. This statement. This would be a senseless statement. The vast majority of people in the community heartily approved of and joined together in an evil deed. That's a meaningless statement. If public approval determines that which is good. Because the majority opinion determining what is good and evil, then the majority of people approving of something could never be approving an evil thing. And yet, don't even people of this particular persuasion that might make that kind of a claim object to majority opinion sometimes? Was everybody happy with the results of the last presidential election? No. But that was the majority ruling. Shouldn't everybody be getting along with it? They can't hold their own standard. Morality doesn't come down to statistics, friends. It doesn't. I had unbelievers claim the societal majority rules, but then they say something like, well, we fought a war against Hitler's Germany to stop their evil, so we fought a war, so that's fine. Hold up. They were completely oblivious to their contradiction that they had. That was German society. What right do you have to impose the will of another society on them? Entirely inconsistent. In reality, the goodness of something is actually what produces the approval of it, not the other way around. Even unbelievers insist that something is good or evil, irrespective of the opinions of others on the matter. And they're very often very forceful as they assert this. Think about it this way. If by the use of good, someone just means I approve, then we can never agree with each other in ethical judgments about anything. Even if we approve of the same thing, it's not technically the same judgment to say that I approve of giving to the poor and the A.I.C.P approves of giving to the poor, because we're different people and the judgments that we're rendering are not completely identical. Maybe the unbeliever doesn't want to go that route then. Maybe he wants to think of it this way. Perhaps good is what makes the most people happy. The happiness for the greatest number of people. This is called utilitarianism. We've alluded to it before. And we've said this. The problem here is, what's the standard for happiness? Proving a standard for happiness is really hard.
Well, in the way that utilitarianism is usually articulated, is that they will appeal to the standard of the hedonist. And so it's not as subjective as you might think. They'll talk about eudaimonia, which means that which helps, or that which makes people flourish. So, but it's still, I mean, it doesn't escape subjectivism altogether, but it does try to draw back from that. It's not, in other words, it's not like a subjective ethic. It's at least in there, it ultimately is that, but it's not. They try to get away from that by saying that happiness here is the concept of human flourishing. So what helps humans flourish is that which makes them ultimately happy. You can't be happy like a pig is happy, because you're a human. You have different virtues, different qualities, and so you have so you can't just roll around in your own excrement and eat slop all day and be perfectly satisfied. Humans
No,
can't do
but you
that.
might be able to enslave a small population and thrive from all the work that they do for you and live your best life now.
Except that wouldn't make the most people happy. That would be an example of the flip side of utilitarianism is egoism. So it's not what makes the most people happy; it's what works in my own benefit. So that was Ayn Rand and
Sure.
that sort of thing.
But of course, that leads to the next question. Why should I care about the happiness of most people? Why do I care?
Well, yeah, no, that's true. For the egoist, right? For the utilitarian, that's an altruistic. But what this I think is even a little bit more diabolical, because utilitarianism has you working against your own benefit for the good of the majority. So if it's up to the majority to enslave you and it's going to work for make most people happy, then you have to give up your freedom and be a slave.
Yep, we're actually going to be getting into that very briefly. But
So
that is true. But it has a bunch of other problems that are associated with it as well, including what you just said.
oh yeah,
It's difficult, but so let's use an illustration associated with it. Is it good if I buy ice cream for everyone, but
yes,
I only buy one flavor, and one of the people in the crowd hates that flavor and therefore doesn't get any?
I'll take this.
This is a question that has to come up. Does the unhappiness of the one outweigh the happiness of the many, or vice versa? Why? Uh-oh. Justify that. Uh-oh.
Ursula Le Guin has an excellent short story about this. It's called "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas." It's I'm not going to insert it now. But just
Ones that walk with mobiles?
yeah, Omelas. It's a city. That's the name of a city.
Okay.
A fictional city that she has in mind. It's an excellent
But
demonstration of.
But what you get though, to answer this question, the answer to this question depends on if you're the one or the many. Like the problem, oh, there's that problem again. The problem of the one or the many. It shows up. Philosophy can't deal with this without God.
No, certainly.
This makes it impossible to make moral judgments because you cannot actually measure happiness. But there's a more fundamental problem with it. The more fundamental problem is this: what is intrinsically good? What is intrinsically good? Is it what maximizes freedom? Is that what's good for people? Well, that's true only if what? Only if freedom is good. What makes freedom good? How do you know that? We have every right.
The North Koreans wouldn't agree that freedom's always good.
No. And not just the guy at the top, but all the people that work for it too.
Yeah.
We have every right to ask the unbeliever to prove that something is evil if they try to raise the problem of evil against us. It turns out that however they do so, and it's going to be in one of the ways we just talked about, it will always fail.
One of the critiques I offer with utilitarianism is if it's the greatest good for the greatest number, well, there are a whole lot more chickens than there are humans. So why isn't the greatest good for the greatest number of chickens, instead of the greatest number of humans?
That's actually really good because according to the evolutionist, is there really any ontological difference
No,
between chicken?
and there are more earthworms than there are chickens. So why isn't it good for earthworms? And
Why
you
don't
can
we
just
shoot
keep
the
on
chickens for
going.
eating the earthworms?
There are more single-cell organisms than there are of anything else. So why not for them?
Throw away that Lysol. We better not kill that bacteria.
Well, exactly. So that gets at the A of the whole thing, the arbitrariness. You're just choosing human beings because you're self-interested. Is there any other reason to say that humans should be of consideration here? So
Everything falls to A.I.C.P. It does. All right. Let's go back to the radio call-in show because we interrupted
Sorry.
No, you're excellent. I like your input. It makes the Husker better. Usually. Depends on if you two are going at it. That depends. But it's fun that way. But anyway. I'm sidetracking myself. Now back to the radio call-in show. If we push back against the caller and ask him to show us why child molestation is evil, he's probably going to respond like this. Oh, you don't think that it's evil? Why do you think it's evil? Oh, you mean you don't? Okay, I had something like this happen last week when I was interacting with someone on one of those. Did you see that? One of those news posts about all sorts of mad things.
oh yeah.
But he actually was on one of. He responded to you with something inappropriate, and I challenged him on it. And he said, "Well, he's being a bigoted jerk." And I said, "Well, why is being bigoted wrong?"
Oh, you don't think it's wrong?
Yeah, actually, he didn't quite say it. That was like, I'm not going to talk to someone who doesn't even think being bigoted is wrong. Fine, bye. It's like, first of all, you're assuming that I didn't think it was wrong, which is the wrong assumption.
Right.
And then I challenged him on. I was like, justify why being bigoted is wrong. I can as a Christian. How about you? Mr. Unbeliever. Never responded. That happens a lot in social media. It's really easy on social media just to
Yeah.
disengage completely. And what's the word the young people use these days, to ghost someone? But in any case,
25,000 G.
but in a situation like that, on the radio program, you have an opportunity to say something more. You don't think it's evil? Okay, of course we say that it's evil. Of course we do. We just know why. We can tell you why. Our worldview accounts for that judgment that it is evil. We believe in the Almighty Creator God who made heaven and earth, who has a perfect holy character and has revealed himself as such. Because of this, God, we can say that child molestation is evil and it ought to be punished, even with death. It ought to be. It's a heinous violation of the seventh commandment, among other things. But the unbeliever, what can he claim? What kind of judgment can he make? How can he make a claim about morality about this or lack thereof? On what basis does the unbeliever call something evil? Now, if he gives an answer that's arbitrary, like relativism, then he loses the argument. The caller told Dr. Bonson that evil is what gives displeasure or unhappiness. That was the response of the caller. Uh-oh. Any one of us in here can refute that at this point. Bonson was the gold standard for this sort of thing. He didn't let that get away. Bonson then told the caller that if God doesn't exist and good is what gives people pleasure and happiness, we have a serious problem. You have just undid all of your objection, Mr. Unbeliever, because what the molester did apparently gave him a great deal of happiness. Did I sound a little angry? Maybe I was.
Well, he just provided a basis for the
Provided
molester.
justification for child molestation is what he did. He didn't realize it. We see that, right? How big is the sea getting now for consequences? I mean, seriously. The irony is he was being angry at God about this molestation, but in the process, he ended up condoning it. Because what he was left with without God is that everyone does what is right in his own eyes, and no one can say that it's wrong. Ugh. That's an inescapable conclusion. The consequences of that position the caller was taking without realizing he was rightly indignant over that evil when trying to blame God for it, approved it.
Your worldview is the reason people do that.
Mm-hmm. The caller had to pause and think about this one. And he did. Bonson left the illustration at that point. But you see, people who have this philosophy, by the way, that everyone does what is right in his own eyes, they never really mean it. Never. What they mean is that everyone can do what is right in my eyes. As long as they do what I want, then fine. So if you provide the counterexample, the molester, and that you can't condemn him, if it really is different strokes for different folks. He's doing what's right in his eyes, after all. Apparently, some people molest children to get their thrills. Sorry to be so crass about it, but that's what it amounts to. The unbeliever will reply, if you say something like that, I don't believe that. And we should say, good, I don't believe it either. But you need to give me an account for your moral outrage. Because if your position is true, then you just condoned what he did. We don't want that world. You don't want that world, Mr. Unbeliever. There's only one way out of it. Into Jesus Christ. Because then we have the standard and the righteous indignation to condemn that wickedness and throw the book at anybody who dares to try to do it. When a person condemns anything, they are assuming moral absolutes, something which does not make sense outside of the Christian worldview. Anything. Anything. Condemn anything. Other than maybe Canada geese or an Canada geese should have taken it. That's fine. But if you condemn anything with a moral condemnation, it has to assume the Christian worldview. Remember the checklist. A.I.C.P. You cannot begin to make sense of the problem of evil without a Christian conception of the world. An objective, absolute moral standard, something that only flows from our God. I'm not done though. Sometimes the unbeliever, having been backed into a corner by this reasoning, will try a different objection. He will admit that he can't call something evil, but you Christians call things evil, don't you? Well, yes, we do. So how is it then, in our worldview, that we call something truly evil and still believe that God is all powerful and good? That's a different question, isn't it? They're trying to do an internal critique on us at that point.
Okay.
Okay, I'll play that game. Happily. We need to show that there's no inconsistency here. And that's where presuppositional thinking shines, quite honestly. We evaluate experiences in light of our ultimate assumptions, right? Yes, we do. As Christians, we affirm that the Bible is our ultimate authority, and in the Bible we learn that God is all good and all powerful. So he is. Therefore, my ultimate presupposition, my ultimate commitment, my ultimate authority tells me that God is all good and all powerful, and somebody points out that there's evil in this world, I'm going to evaluate that in terms of my ultimate commitment, my ultimate authority, my ultimate presupposition. Therefore, when we see evil in this world, we reach that conclusion. God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil in the world that exists. Which completely destroys the argument that they try to bring against us philosophically for the problem of evil in the first place. There's evil. If your God is all powerful and all good, those don't work. Well, no, in the Christian worldview, God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil that exists in this world. He has a good reason for what he does. Always. Even if it's allowing evil to exist, and even if he uses it for his good purposes, which he does all the time. This is more powerful and more logically profound than we tend to think. The unbeliever brings evil to you. He thinks you need to evaluate that evil in a neutral fashion. But if you approach it neutrally, then the question of whether or not God exists is valid, but no one's neutral. We've talked about that a bunch of times. But my commitment is to this God. So I draw the conclusion that evil has a morally sufficient reason for its existence in this world. All of it, without exception. There is no meaningless evil in this world. Because it's all part of God's ultimate plan. A mysterious plan that I don't understand, but it's part of his plan. That is as formally consistent as the unbeliever's reasoning about God not being able to be both all powerful and all good. But it's more reasonable overall. So we tell non-believers that not only do we believe that God is all good and all powerful, but we believe he has a good reason for literally everything that he does. With that, there's no more logical problem of evil. God has a justified reason to do it. It's his perfect plan. It's his glorious purposes. It's gone. Bye. But you were going to say something, don't you?
Go ahead.
I was going to take the next step past that, though. So,
That was good. Yeah, so was I. Go ahead.
Okay.
That's cool.
but having said that, the logical problem is gone. It's not just a logical problem. We talked about that already. The problem of evil ultimately really isn't a logical problem. It's a psychological problem. We find it hard to accept God's goodness and power at times when he does not give us the reason why bad things happen to us and others. We find that difficult. I found it difficult. It's something about which we struggle sometimes on a daily basis, depending on how severe the difficulty is. The unbeliever demands, whether he says it or not, if there is a morally sufficient reason for the evil that exists, that he deserves to know what it is. That's what his implication is. We cry out this way too sometimes, don't we?
So did Job.
So did Job. So did David. The psalmist came, right? They wanted to know. But let's be honest. God very rarely tells us the reasons for the things he does. Very, very rarely. This is an important verse to memorize.
Things revealed.
Secret things belong to the Lord our God. Things revealed belong to us and to our children forever. So we take what's revealed, i.e. the scriptures, and we study them, we learn them, we apply them, we teach them to our children and our friends and our neighbors and the unbeliever at Kroger and everywhere else. But the secret things, the things that God hasn't told us, that belong to him, and we can't pry into them. Not only do we not have a right to pry into them, we can't pry into them because he hasn't told us. The only way we know about God is because he's told us about himself. And honestly, even if God were to tell us, would we even understand it at all? How far beyond us is the mind of God? Again, there's that creator divide that cannot be crossed. He is so far beyond us in his thinking and reasoning. How arrogant to think that we'd be able to figure it all out if he told us even. Arrogance is the right word for this. Isaiah 55:8 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." His thoughts are higher than ours, the text goes on to say. But the fact remains, he hasn't given us reasons. He promises that he has a perfect plan. He promises that he works all things together for good. He promises that he is for his people. God does have a morally sufficient reason for everything that he does. Therefore, he can be trusted always to be doing that which is good, even with the presence of evil in this world. Now, do you think the unbeliever is going to accept that? No. Not if he remains an unbeliever. He will not trust God unless he, the unbeliever, thinks that God has a good enough reason for the evil in this world. He wants to put God on trial. That's not how this works. You don't get to say back to God anything. It's like, so unless God consents to trade places with the sinner's not going to trust him, huh? To quote the Avengers movie again, right? We don't do that here. Seriously, God doesn't do that. He is God. We are not. We bow to him. He doesn't bow to us. And to use the example of Job, like you talked about before, when Job thought he had all these questions and had a good case to go against God, God showed up and said, "Who are you? Where were you when I did all this? What do you think you really know?" "I'm sorry, God. I'm not finished." God raked him twice. And what was Job's response? That's the only response. We must have faith in God and his word instead of our own thinking.
In my philosophy 101 class, they do a section on the problem of evil. And one of the things that I point out at the end of so is there an answer, and it's always a good sort of rhetorical fun time, because it does put the Christians in sort of a place where they don't know how to respond to that. But one of the things that I always bring up is Romans, and this was something I got from John Piper in a sermon of his somewhere along the line, and it's from Romans 5:8. Romans 5:8 is that God shows his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And I quote that verse to them and I say, well, this is the Christian answer to the problem of evil. That the ultimate expression of God's love is that he would show his love for his people by Christ dying for our sins. In order for God to do that, he has to have a world where there's sin. And he has to have a world where there is death in order for Christ to die for sins. So God reveals himself in his love for his people by creating a world where there is sin and there's death, although he himself did not create that sin and that death.
Though, and something we talked about in Sunday school this morning, God intended for the fall to happen.
Absolutely.
For that reason.
It is not outside of his control. And God creates a world where there is sin and where there is death, like you said. Sin is not meaningless. Suffering is not meaningless. Death is not meaningless. There is sin and there's death. And the whole reason for sin and death existing is so that God could show the glory of the love of Christ for his people. Because the world is not centered around our comfort level. It's centered around the glory of God and God displaying his glory. And ultimately, that's part of the answer anyway. That this world doesn't revolve around you. And Piper goes on to say, he says, you may not have done it that way, but guess what?
You're not God.
You're not God. You're not God, and that's good.
And that's the answer to the question from earlier. We made a world like this? Well, maybe not, but I'm not God.
Yeah.
God knows what he's doing better than I do.
We
How can you say that? Because he's God and I'm dumb.
Yeah. We get it hung up in it because there's the free will answer to the problem of evil.
I came up too.
There's a whole bunch of these answers, and they're all man-centered. And we need to divorce ourselves from thinking in terms of God being there for us. And I love Bodhi Baucham's explanation of that, which if you have time afterwards, you got to watch. It's like a 3-minute clip, and it's hilarious.
Bodhi's
Bodhi. But he does it so much better than I could. But
Dr. Baucham is amazing.
Yeah.
But
I mean, to me, that's like, okay, I'm more than sad. That's a more than morally sufficient reason.
and we can look at it and play it after we're done with the screen for the evening. But it really is a question of ultimate authority. Who really is in charge of all this? It's true for everyone. We judge by what God has said. Because once you take things out from underneath the ultimate authority of God, you remove the ability to have moral judgment at all. There's that C again. We don't want that. And this is something else that's interesting too. Oh well. Because I'm going to ask this question anyway. By the way, do unbelievers, different unbelievers, have the same moral standard anyway? Even different atheists? No. So which of your arbitrary standards am I going to pick, right? But do we trust God? Or do we trust ourselves? I mean, the sin and all its accompanying evils entered the world through Adam and Eve, of course. The question with which they were faced is the same question that exists for us today. Do we take God on his word because he said so? Do we trust him? Or do we evaluate what God said based on our own moral and intellectual authority? Do we trust God or do we trust ourselves? God told Adam and Eve not to eat the tree and told them to trust him. And he knew what he was doing. Satan comes along and challenges God's authority, telling Eve that she can't trust God. The entire course of history depended on how she would handle that question. She ought to have told Satan he had no right to call God's goodness into question. Instead, she determined that she would be the final judge, and this is where evil comes from. So when unbelievers refuse to accept the goodness of God, they are simply perpetuating all of our human woes, following in the footsteps of our first parents. Rather than solving the problem of evil, the unbeliever is part of the problem of evil. Game, set, match. In summary, first, the problem of evil does not provide intellectual basis for a lack of faith in God. Rather, it's a personal expression of a lack of faith. God even humbles us here, doesn't he? Is he going to be God? Will he be God? Or will we try to be God? Why does evil exist? We talked about it. To glorify God all the more fully. How does all that work? Not sure. Don't really know. We're going to have to wait to find out. But if you don't want to glorify and trust him, you're going to find out you can't call anything evil at all. There's that C again. So from the preconditions of intelligibility, we've solved the problem of evil. Only God can account for that which is good, righteous, morally upright, to be able to condemn evil in the first place. Related to this issue is the doctrine of hell. God is right to punish sin forever because he's that holy and sin is that bad. God is just. What about when lots of people die suddenly, like in an earthquake or a tidal wave or something? That's a slightly different question. Some people will accuse God of genocide when things like that happen, but this isn't imposing an absolute standard by which God will be judged. But how is there an absolute standard unless God is the one behind that standard, right? But all these innocent children died. Innocent? Says who? By what standard? In what way? Before God? Doesn't breath, life itself, belong to our God? Doesn't he get to do with it as he pleases? Yes. That's not a problem in the Christian worldview, which is the worldview that actually is the true worldview. Even someone who's never heard the gospel? Yes. God is just, and if anyone ever draws breath, that is an act of God's grace. God never sends anyone to hell for not believing the gospel, but for violating the law of God they already know in the natural order and the reality of God they know through nature, which they do. The moment that they continue in this world and drawing breath, the breath that God puts into them is an act of his grace. That is 7 o'clock. And it's also my last slide. Until I start getting into some of these things. I haven't made more slides yet. That's right. I have it in this document, but I don't have it on my slides yet. I'll do that this week. Again, next week will be our final class session. Next week, we will have several case examples, like I mentioned. We will discuss for a little while the issue of Jehovah's Witnesses and anything that you want to bring to the table. We will deal with that at that time as well. It's 7 o'clock and it's still daylight outside.
Sun is shining.
That's nice.
It kind of is. I admit I'm not upset about going to my tribal still days. No. There's some shady characters walking through a parking lot every now and then.
We do. That's why we wanted the cameras up there.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. All right. anyone said anything in the chat?
There's 3 people watching.
There are 3 people watching them.
Hi, guys.
Hello. Wave at the camera. Hi, everybody.
How can you tell?
There's a little thing.
There's a little number.
Counter.
I don't see it. Oh, it is 3. See, 3.
Oh.
I can point at it, and then you have the infinite disappearance of my hand. Actually, that's off camera here. It's the one over there. All right, then. Well, then we'll wrap this particular class session up. Hang around a little afterwards. Discuss things. If anybody out there's watching who wants to type something in for a question real quick, I'll give you about another 30 seconds or so. It's how long it takes for it to go out and come back. Or maybe someone to type. See nothing. Then let's pray and we'll be done. We gotta thank you for what we've been able to learn in this class up to this point. Look forward to the final session. Analyze some examples, put some of this into practice. Use what we've learned, Lord God, I pray that you make us bold and confident, talking about you and defending the faith and making Christ known. May your Spirit's power please make it effective in the hearts of unbelievers. Destroy unbelief and replace it with